Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Political State. I'm Ben Felder here in the Oklahoman's video studios. Joining me, my Political State co-hosts, Justin Wingeter, Dale Dinwalt. And gentlemen, this is going to be our final episode of 2018. We're going to take a break next week, the Christmas holiday. We'll come back in the start of the new year, but given that this is our last episode of the year, this is obviously a time of reflection. A lot of lists being produced right now, so I thought we would kind of make a list or a moment of reflection of our own and kind of look at some of the big political storylines from this past year. And there were quite a few. Obviously, election year produced some of that, but a lot of other drama to recap. And Justin, I asked you to kind of bring your three top stories, not necessarily in order, but from the federal government beat that you cover, and Dale, you with state government that you've been covering. And so Dale, let's start with you. So like I said, not necessarily in any particular order. But what do you feel like were the three biggest state political storylines of 2018?
When you asked me to think about this, the first thing that came to mind was the election. Not only the general election, but the primary election. Mm-hmm. And not only the primary election, but the people who didn't run for re-election. Yeah. You talk about the turnover in state government this year. It's been phenomenal. It's phenomenal as in incredibly significant. Yeah. Because so many people who were at the Capitol last year are not coming back when the legislature convenes again in February. Some of that is due to just being tired of the job, and knowing that they may not win re-election. Some of those actually lost their re-election bids in the primary. And so you're coming into a situation with a lot of new people and people who are going to have to learn how things work at the Capitol. But really I think the top political story of the year is what voters did to legislative incumbents.
Yeah, and elections are, it's always going to be a big storyline in an election year. But as you said, more than maybe other years, there seemed to be a lot of that turnover, some because incumbents lost, which up until this year was kind of a, just didn't happen. Yeah. You also saw some members not run again. There's kind of been this general sense that the legislature has kind of moved more to a moderate position. Part of that is because some of the incumbents that were never taxers that really kind of stood in the way of some of the tax packages the majority of the legislature on both sides of the aisle was supportive of. They stood in the way, and many of those lawmakers lost their seat. But then I also think we don't know the answer to that. We don't know if that's completely true yet, because there's so many new lawmakers that I don't know that we have a good handle yet on what where they fall on the political scale. Right.
We only know who we don't have anymore. Right. Only a member or two from the platform caucus, the very sort of very conservative members who, like you said, would vote against the just about everything that the leadership wanted. Mm-hmm. Most of them are gone. But do we know enough about the people coming in to say whether they would join something like a platform caucus if they had come in any other year?
Yeah, I mean, there's no legislative history for when you have so many new members, and we don't know what issues are kind of near and dear to their heart. A lot of people ran on education. A lot of people ran on just kind of wanting to bring practical solutions. Some had details, some didn't. We don't know what lobbyists have gotten to them. I always think of that scene in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, or whatever the first one was called, where every kid wins, and then there's that the guy from the competing chocolate company that's always in the ear right immediately. It kind of changes their tune. And we don't know what the impact of that is going to be yet. But yeah, so many new lawmakers, and with a improved financial situation next year.
That's right.
Maybe some of that gridlock, is not going to take place, and so maybe it's going to be an easy governing experience. But we don't know what we don't know, and when truth be told, we don't know, a lot about these new lawmakers.
That's right. It really remains to be seen. And as far as the question about whether this legislature has gotten more moderate, I think you'll probably see a little bit of that, but you'll also see the Republicans, by the way, there are a lot of Republicans still in the legislature trying to find where the edge is of where they think they can go with the political mindset that is out there right now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, elections, big one. What else you got for us?
Medical marijuana was a huge story. Mm-hmm. Obviously, voters passed it on the same day as the primary election, and really had to kick the government in the butt to actually try to do something to get the law in a place where it can be enacted and functioning. And some leaders in the legislature started very quickly convening meetings to talk about what they thought was a good course of action. Now that we had this law, and no law exists in a vacuum, and so they spent several months trying to figure out what kind of policies need to be added or removed or enhanced as part of this industry that is brand new in the state of Oklahoma. And although it's been around in other states for a decade or more, it's still kind of uneasy. People feel uneasy about how the industry is going to work.
Yeah, and this is an issue that many conservatives are more likely to probably frown on medical marijuana. Sure. Although a conservative state like Oklahoma passed it, voters passed it, and so there was kind of this conflict. A mostly Republican legislature, many of which who were outspoken in their opposition, were now kind of forced to act, and it really kind of changed the political landscape, changed the actual landscape. Just driving through the city, I mean, you see a lot of these medical marijuana shops popping up. But yeah, this was a really interesting moment of the will of the people being spoken, and lawmakers kind of having to scramble in an election year, and that probably had a lot of influence in an election year, trying to scramble to meet the voters' demands.
And it really, I think, taught lawmakers to listen to their constituents, because even if a state representative from wherever was against medical marijuana, and all of a sudden he sees returns come from his district that it was voted overwhelmingly for, he's going to have to change his tune, or if he starts speaking out against it or trying to revoke parts of it, he's going to upset a lot of the people in his constituency, or hers. Yeah. Just as an example. So it was kind of, I think, a watershed moment for Oklahoma politics, in that the people definitively said something that they wanted that you wouldn't normally think that Oklahoma would really go for, and that's medical marijuana.
Yeah. And you have the ramification it had just on that election. The turnout was through the roof. It was unheard of numbers for a primary turnout. That had some ramifications elsewhere on the ballot. So yeah, that's a big issue, not only in implementation, but politically speaking. I mean, just the effect it had on that one election.
Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about medical marijuana as a significant policy issue for years.
Yeah, something the legislature is going to have to deal with, really, it has been dealing with, but it's definitely going to be a priority for them in this next session. All right, your number one story, I don't know if this is your number one, but your third from 2018.
Right, the third story, the teacher walkout and everything having to do with that. Part of that ties into elections, but the teachers decided enough is enough. Education is not getting the funding it needs, even though the legislature passed and the governor signed a teacher pay raise bill just days before the planned walkout. The leaders of the walkout said we're going to continue because we're not necessarily fighting for more teacher pay, for only more teacher pay. We're fighting for education funding, and that's why they spent 2 weeks at the Capitol, spread out, packed into the Capitol and spread out on the Capitol grounds, agitating, really trying to get legislators to realize that that they want more education funding, and the per pupil spending in Oklahoma has decreased over a number of years.
Yeah, and that walkout really set the tone for almost every political storyline of the past year, especially with the elections. I mean, a lot of people were kind of trying to take that momentum and making education a central issue. And I think going back to the beginning of statehood, people running for office would probably talk about education being important, but it really seemed to kind of really highlight that attention on education on the specific issues, primarily funding, teacher pay. The raise happened, so maybe less of an attention on teacher pay. But the whole idea of funding in the classroom really seemed to just, impact almost every race across the state. And of course, you had dozens of teachers that were also running, and this was just kind of I think in a state that has struggled in so many ways. I mean, whether if you're a teacher, you can talk about the way that budget cuts have impacted you, but if you work in the healthcare system, if you work in transportation, if you're a state trooper being limited on your miles a day, I mean, almost everybody across state government, the workers that are the lifeblood of these industries, these agencies, can tell you that, tell you their own stories of challenges over the last decade.
Right.
And so while teachers were the center of attention on the walkout, some other public employees also joined in. But this really seemed to be that kind of, and I've said this before, that kind of scream in the pillow moment for public workers and just for Oklahomans in general, who have just felt like the last decade has been just this time of decline. And I think both major candidates for governor really reflected that. Edmondson, talking about wanting to increase education funding and really trying to rally those educators in his camp, but even Stitt with his talk of, I want to be top 10. I think that was a direct response to Oklahomans feeling like for the last decade we're on the bottom of every list and we continue to that decline, and it's just this moment of intense frustration.
As reporters, we've always wondered where the boiling point would be. At what point is this going to reach critical mass, so to speak? And I think that happened this year. Every voter I talked to not only listed education as, if not their #1 issue, and say in the top 3, but they were well versed in the issue enough to be able to talk about it. Yeah. They had examples. They knew numbers. They knew what they wanted, and part of that also stems, I think, from an increase in voter understanding of the issues. A general understanding of the issues when it comes to state government that's been building over the last 2 or 3 years, because the budget was such a big problem. Oklahoma was cutting back every year and having massive shortfalls, and it really got people's attention. And I think maybe if people hadn't already been so attuned to what the government was doing, I don't know if the fight over education spending and teacher pay would have taken quite as hard of a grip on the psyche of Oklahomans as it did this year.
Yeah.
So I think that probably contributed. But yeah, just amazing the level of interest among all walks of life here in this state when it comes to teachers and education.
Yeah, they had those old textbooks too. Those tattered old textbooks became a rallying cry in themselves. There, all 3 of us were there. I mean, at the walkout, it was something to behold. And I can remember driving down 23rd, and the people above you are just yelling down at you. Their signs and everything. Yeah, it was a wild time at the Capitol, and yeah, the public engagement with their government was incredible.
And that was, and no matter where you fall on the spectrum, because there's plenty of people who were opposed to the walkout and didn't, weren't in the teacher's corner, and you saw that from some lawmakers that responded in a negative way. But no matter where you come on just the policy ideas or politically, this was one of the biggest demonstrations of democracy in action that we've seen, at least in terms of the symbolism of that. I mean, I remember there were moments, there was a different feeling outside the Capitol and the inside. Outside was this kind of, public education rally, kind of a carnival-like, tailgate atmosphere. Inside you had, at times, teachers chanting nonstop, literally outside the doors of the House, and you could hear it on there, chanting for them to, increase taxes, eliminate the capital gains tax deduction, literally spelling out capital gains on the lawn. I mean, this was Oklahomans, mostly teachers, but not all. There were, parents and other members of the community that were there, demanding action of their lawmakers. And the Capitol truly is kind of the quote-unquote people's house, and more so than any other event. We really saw that this year with the walkout.
Yeah. Never saw as many people as I did, especially for as long. And I was able to a couple of times sort of mingle into the middle of the crowd during one of those times when there was a lot of fervor going on. There was a vote happening in the House chamber that the crowd didn't like, and the energy, it was almost infectious. Having I don't know how many people you could cram in that building, a few thousand, chanting and yelling. It was an amazing sight to behold, one that I didn't think I would ever get to experience, but you see on TV sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the last walkout was in the 1990s, so 28 years later. So I guess we've got another 30 years to 28 to 30 years to see this again, a once in a generational movement, our moment. So obviously plenty of other state storylines, but yeah, I think you hit it on the head with those three. So Justin, taking a look at the kind of the federal beat that you cover as it relates to Oklahoma, your top three stories, I imagine elections are going to be part of that, but what do you got for us?
Yeah, I'm going to count down.
You're actually going to give us the...
Yeah, and feel free to disagree with my order here. That's part of the fun here. Number three, I'm going with Carpenter v. Murphy, the U.S. Supreme Court case on the Creek Reservation. Arguments were heard throughout the year, still will be heard into next year, and we'll have a decision next year as well. The ramifications here are just fascinating. It's not strictly a political story, and my other two are, and so it's probably not at the top for that reason, but the ramifications, the fascination with this case cannot really be undercut. Not only will we see what it results in, but just the interplay here between the state and the tribes, where there has been a lot of coordination in recent years. You go back a few decades, there were court cases all the time. They're always at odds. And now you have more cooperation, and it's almost threatened by this case. So far, the two sides have gotten along, but they've been chippy at times. There has been some back and forth, especially with the state's lawyer, Lisa Blatt, arguing at the Supreme Court some very dire results or predictions from this, and the tribes push back on that. And so it's a fascinating case for a lot of reasons, and it will continue into next year. But I think this year alone, it's been an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, depending on how the decision goes next year, that could be the biggest story, one of the biggest, could be in your top three next year again. We do this in a year. But for those who may not be too familiar with, I mean, what's at stake here? What are the possible ramifications?
It kind of depends who you ask, and that is at the center of the case. I mean, strictly speaking, it's whether or not the Creeks still have what you consider a traditional reservation, which is not what Oklahoma has called a reservation. It's one where they more or less own, they have some jurisdiction within the areas. Right here, we're talking about criminal jurisdiction. So strictly speaking, it would just be, if there are major cases against or committed by Native Americans on what was formerly the Creek Reservation, which was given to them in 1866, then those cases would have to be tried in federal court rather than state court. So that, strictly speaking, is the only effect. Now, the state argues that it goes much beyond that. That, first of all, it wouldn't just be the Creeks, it would be all of the 5 tribes, because they have similar histories, different at times, but fairly similar. And so the state argues that half of eastern Oklahoma, or the half of Oklahoma, all of eastern Oklahoma, more or less, would be a reservation. And that would have effects on oil and gas, it would have effects on environmental regulations, on taxes, on gaming, et cetera, et cetera. The Creeks argue it's much more limited than that. It would have effect on some criminal jurisdiction only within the 7 counties or so that make up the Creek Reservation. So it depends who you ask, and that's a volatile topic right there as far as what ramifications it would have.
Yeah, all right. I agree with you. I think you're right so far with number 3. So that maybe that moves up the list next year depending on what happens.
Yeah,
but what do you got for
absolutely.
number 2?
Number 2, I'm going with the scandals and resignation of Scott Pruitt. I mean, the resignation came in July, I believe it was, July 10th, if I recall correctly, and so you have months and months of scandals, of national news about this. I mean, it just continued every single time. Just when you thought he couldn't take any more, he continued to stay in office, and he continued to, reporters continue to find new things to write about. It just continued for months and months. I'm fascinated not only by what that means for the EPA and for Pruitt himself, but you have kind of a butterfly effect here in Oklahoma politics. This is someone who, I would argue, if Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, he's a heck of a lot better off right now. I mean, he would stay as AG, he would continue suing the federal government as he did and grew to national fame doing so under the Obama administration. And he's probably well set for a run if he wants to do the Senate in 2020 or whatever it is he's looking for, a future political run. He just continues to amass support. Instead, he joins the EPA. He's beaten down by, scandals for just a year and a half or whatever it was, and eventually leaves, and not the way you want to leave office, certainly. Now any political run is going to get difficult. Any ads against him, his primary and general election opponents would just beat him up constantly. From so many of those spending scandals especially are going to speak to Oklahomans who don't make a lot of money. And here's Pruitt spending money on things like or his security. I mean, he's having his security drive him around expensive restaurants or to buy a certain lotion. I mean, it just would have if he tries to run again, and he may, it's going to be very difficult for him. So that changes the kind of the pecking order of Republican politics in the state, in my opinion.
And one of probably the most Trumpian of his picks, probably. I mean, one of the guys that probably was more in tune with Trump's, vision for how to run an agency than others.
Yeah, it still is.
I mean, like you mentioned, I mean, Pruitt had been, constantly suing the EPA, was the villain to the EPA, now found himself in charge of it. And we've talked about this before, from a policy perspective, probably Trump was very pleased with everything he did. And if you are a fervent Trump supporter, you probably really supported the direction that Pruitt was taking the EPA. Yet he couldn't survive those kind of scandals, and also kind of similar to Trump, because it's been talked about a lot recently. I mean, from every direction right now, Trump is getting investigated in various ways, and the same thing was happening with Pruitt, and he just couldn't stand, just couldn't handle that pressure. Was too much after a while, and he had to leave office.
Yep.
So I like that. Number 2, that's a good one, and I hadn't even remembered that. But that's a good one. Well, so many things have happened here.
Yeah, fair enough.
And it's been a while since we talked about Pruitt, so
it has
it's easy
been,
to forget. All right, your number 1. I'm curious to see what you got.
The election of Kendra Horn. I think the walkout is the single biggest political story in the state this year. I think Kendra Horn's probably pretty close there. I mean, 538 statistically says this is the single biggest upset of the midterm elections this year, across the whole country, and there were plenty of them. I mean, it just tells us so much, not only about this. I mean, specifically her winning and that race, which is fascinating in itself. And it tells us things about this district, about Oklahoma County, about just this changing urban versus rural dynamics. There's a lot to pick apart there, and we've done it quite a bit. But to me, it's just kind of a catalyst to talk about so many other things. That it was a fascinating race to cover, to write about, and now we have, into next year, we have a Democrat in an otherwise all Republican congressional delegation. We have a Democrat representing this city for the first time in decades. I'm looking even this weekend on some articles into what that means. What does it mean for federal transportation spending? I mean, things like just a number of different areas. I've talked about it so much, I don't know what more to say about this race, but to me, it's one of the fascinating stories. And on my federal list, the most interesting federal politics news of the year.
And it was such a surprising win, and at the same time, maybe it shouldn't have been. And I think, I want to point out and kind of give you credit because, I mean, you were following her campaign since day one, and giving it, not that we're rooting for anybody, obviously, but, giving her campaign some weight and some legitimacy. I mean, your coverage was, treating her like a viable candidate because, demographically speaking in this district, she was a viable candidate. I mean, you had stories before where, outsiders had said, hey, when you look at the back of Oklahoma City's baseball card, it should be a Democratic city in some ways.
Yeah.
It just hasn't been. And so, you reported on this, and I know recently, obviously the New York Times, had a video story from here just basically saying, a city that's growing more diverse, that's growing younger, that this is what, a Democratic city looks like, and her win kind of solidifies that. Now, has the pendulum gone all the way to the other way? Is this a Democratic, district forever? I think it's too soon to say that. There's a lot of people say, Oklahoma City's Democrat now, and will be forever. I think in 2 years there's going to be a pretty competitive race for this district as well. But this was just kind of the culmination of what we know about Oklahoma City politically, not just at the congressional level, but Democrats made some gains where they lost seats in rural parts of the state. They gained in Oklahoma City, particularly in the northwest part of the city. So this is a transitioning city politically, and Kendra Horn really, is kind of the poster child for that.
And this will be the most interesting race to watch in 2020. I will say right now, it may be one of my list in 2020.
So you've already got some of your work. You only have 2 things to pick next year, and you probably only have 2 things to pick the year after that. Given that, but yeah, no, I agree with the list.
So after this is a question about Kendra Horn. After she was elected, has she said or done anything that surprises you, or seems to belie her positions as a candidate rather than a representative?
You know, there's the Pelosi stuff right now. I've been a little surprised that she hasn't stated her support for Pelosi or her opposition. She's been just kind of in the middle on it. You know, national Democrats nationwide are getting asked about this time and time again. I'm a little surprised she doesn't have an answer publicly right now. That's about it. I mean, otherwise, we're just so very early on, and she hasn't taken office yet, as you know, of course, and won't for a couple more weeks, and so we'll see. But it'll be interesting to watch, even like small stuff like who her staff is, and that may look very different than we've traditionally seen a congressional staff look like here. Where her office is, the district office. You don't overanalyze these things, but I mean, clearly the last couple mayors have wanted the congressional office to be in the city, and it hasn't been. Russell's is in Dell City right now, and so even little things like that will be interesting. And then, of course, committee assignments. She really seems to want space and science. She has a history in the space industry, and so what she does there with Congressman Lucas will be ranking member of that committee. So those two could actually pair up quite a bit. How she plays with the other members, I think it'll be pretty cordial. But there's just so much to watch here. If you're a political wonk, it's fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I agree with the ranking of your list.
I want some pushback. I was expecting.
No, I'll go with that. No, I think you had the right order.
All right.
I agree. My stamp of approval on that list. Hey, before we wrap up here, I wanted to take a moment, Dale. You know, you're continuing to be on the show, but your beat's kind of changed, and I'm kind of excited about some of the things that you've already covered. I just kind of wanted to give you a chance to kind of introduce our listeners and viewers to just kind of some of the things that they can expect coming from your desk.
Right. So I'm really focused on aerospace and technology, covering those beats. I'm no longer officing at the Capitol, so I may be somewhat disconnected from what's going on there as I cover the aerospace industry and the ascension of Oklahoma's technology community, which is really incredible. One of the first things that I was really blown away by is how much of a community there is among software developers and people with other jobs that kind of fit into the mold of technology. I think Oklahoma City, there's a lot of really interesting stories in Oklahoma City and in Oklahoma in general on this beat in particular that I really look forward to telling.
Yeah, and there'd be some political threads to that as well. I mean, it's something that the state government has talked a lot about, is expanding the aerospace industry, trying to diversify the economy. But this is the new beat. I think your passion's already clear in some of the early things that you've written about and talked about. So we wish you luck on that. We want you to continue to be on Political State. But
thank you.
Looking forward to that coverage. So, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Political State. As I said at the top, this is going to be our last episode of 2018. We'll be back in a couple weeks, starting the new year. With Justin and Dale, I'm Ben. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. We'll see you in a couple weeks.